So as we said in the introduction, there's been a lot of interest in recent years in understanding the characteristics and factors that make someone an entrepreneur. And what we're going to do in this short section here is just outline some of the broad areas that people have identified as being the characteristics that make up successful entrepreneurs, or at least people who engage in the process of entrepreneurship. Now, one of the things I'll say up front about this is that I tend to believe that these things are indicators but not rules. So just because someone doesn't possess these characteristics doesn't mean that they can't be an entrepreneur. I think it's very important to acknowledge that entrepreneurship is actually quite open to a range of different people. But what we do tend to see though is that people who are certainly more successful in the space of entrepreneurship do tend to possess some of these characteristics. Not necessarily all of the characteristics, but certainly some of the characteristics that we'll talk about in this part of the video. So what I'm going to do is just quickly run through some of these characteristics. Now these characteristics are summarised in a little bit more detail in the textbook, and I'd encourage you to have a look at the textbook. I think it's pages 43 through to about page 48, where they discuss some of these concepts in a little bit more detail. And so it's really important that you read what these concepts are. So let's have a look at, say, entrepreneurial cognition. What we do tend to see is that through research is that entrepreneurs do tend to view and think of situations in very different ways than the average person does. So people who tend to be good at entrepreneurship tend to be good at putting together connections from random pieces of information from the external environment and coming up with new and novel solutions to problems quicker than anyone else can. Okay, so we talk about them being very much problem-solving individuals. So the thought process of an entrepreneur is something that we tend to look at a lot in research, and while these are sort of innate things in people, the way we think, we can actually train ourselves to think in particular ways. And there are actually quite a number of practices that you can use to learn how to think in ways that are more like entrepreneurial thinking. So for example, the design thinking process that we're going to do later in the semester, or the lateral thinking methodology that was developed by Edward de Bono, are good examples of what it means to think in a more entrepreneurial manner. And so you can engage in those techniques, you can learn those techniques, and hopefully through those techniques greatly improve the way that you're able to think like an entrepreneur. Another thing we tend to find about when we think about entrepreneurs is that they're far more determined and have greater perseverance, or what I tend to prefer to think about is the idea of resilience. Entrepreneurs tend to be able to take knocks and setbacks better than others. Where other people might turn away in disgust or in frustration, an entrepreneur is likely to look at those problems and say, okay, well, what have I learnt? How can I do things differently in the future? And what might I change about the way I approach similar problems in any future situation? Entrepreneurs also have a very strong drive to achieve. Entrepreneurs are focused on outcomes. We tend to talk about them being goal-focused. And so because they're goal-focused, they have this very high level of drive to achieve those goals. They do everything in their power to ensure that as an individual they actually achieve the outcomes that they set. And so again, entrepreneurs as a general rule tend to be much more motivated, much more focused on outcomes. Linked to the idea of entrepreneurial cognition is the idea that an entrepreneur tends to have a very strong opportunity orientation. We talked about a little bit about this in week 1 or in topic 1 of this unit, and it's the idea that rather than seeing problems, what entrepreneurs tend to see are opportunities. They tend to see ways of cutting through and coming up with solutions to situations that your average person doesn't tend to see. Now, some would say that this opportunity orientation is probably the hardest thing for people to acquire, because it does tend to be very much linked to our personality. You know, some people are much more positive, they're more focused, and they believe that with the right supports and resources in place that they can achieve anything that they set their mind to. And so they do have a much stronger orientation around pursuing opportunities. Entrepreneurs also tend to be very good at seeking feedback. They value the criticism, they value other people's inputs, and they view that as a way to learn and develop. Now, receiving feedback does not always sit well with people. Some people are afraid that people might say negative things about them, and that might impact upon the way they see themselves or how they believe themselves to be successful or otherwise. But entrepreneurs do tend to, by and large, be much more responsive to receiving any type of feedback because they know that only through getting feedback are we able to learn about what works and what doesn't work within a particular situation. Entrepreneurs also have what's called a very high internal locus of control. So they tend to believe that they're the master of their own destiny, that any success or problems that they experience are a direct function of their actions and that they can control the situations around them. Rather than blaming other people, rather than being externally focused, they believe that it's their internal activities and abilities that are going to drive their success as an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs also have a very high tolerance for ambiguity. We've talked about the notion that entrepreneurship is all about entering into new situations or changing situations where the rules of what we currently know and expect are going to change. And so if you're going to engage in that space, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, then you need to be able to tolerate the ambiguity that comes with those sorts of conditions. So a tolerance for ambiguity is a very important skill that all entrepreneurs need to work at developing over time. You'll also see quite often discussion in the literature on entrepreneurship about the notion that entrepreneurs are risk takers. Now, there is some debate here as to whether entrepreneurs really are risk takers or not. Some people would say that rather than being, extreme risk takers, what entrepreneurs are much better at doing is taking calculated risks. So looking at a situation, identifying the risk, but also being very good at identifying the payoffs and saying, you know what, the returns far outweigh the risks, and so therefore I'm going to pursue that opportunity. There's actually an interesting article from Malcolm Gladwell that actually looks at this issue of entrepreneurs taking calculated risks. Entrepreneurs also have a high tolerance of failure. They tend to be willing to accept failure and view failure, while it's not necessarily a good outcome, they accept that failure is an important part of them growing and developing as an entrepreneur. And so as a result, they enjoy being in situations where they can gain feedback from those failures. A bit like the achievement outcome, we also know that entrepreneurs have very high energy levels. They tend to be very upbeat, very positive and outgoing people. That also links into the notion of being very creative and innovative. They're often able to look at complex situations in very different ways that other people wouldn't ever consider thinking about. Entrepreneurs also tend to have very strong vision, and I think this is very much linked to the goal focus or the opportunity focus that entrepreneurs have, that they have visions about where they would like to go in the future, and they make it their mission to try and achieve those objectives with the minimum amount of fuss and wastage. So they believe that by engaging in proper, robust entrepreneurial processes that they can achieve those outcomes. And entrepreneurs are team builders. I've said this already a few times this semester. Entrepreneurs do not do it on their own. The job of an entrepreneur is to work as part of a team to achieve objectives and outcomes. So successful entrepreneurs are very good at bringing people together, at working with and through people to achieve the objectives they want to achieve. And by building a team that is able to sustain itself even in the face of significant external pressure. So, when you're going through a startup process, it's not easy to maintain motivation. But an entrepreneur is good at building a team that is able to sustain themselves during that process. And when we think about entrepreneurship, we also need to think about the concept of entrepreneurial leadership. It's really important that organisations or individuals try and build their abilities as entrepreneurial leaders, because whenever you're driving a change process, you're going to have to lead people through that process. So it's really important that they have the skills that are linked to the leadership of people. So entrepreneurial leadership is defined as organising a group of people to achieve a common goal using proactive entrepreneurial behaviour to optimise risk, innovate to take advantage of opportunities, taking personal responsibility, and managing change within a dynamic environment. So to be an entrepreneurial leader, you have to have all of those sorts of attributes, those sorts of abilities, to be able to manage your group and your organisation through some quite challenging and difficult times as the business is being started up. And really what the entrepreneurial leader does is provide the clear vision and focus that the organisation needs to take it forward as it goes through into its new business venture. So what you should do now is go back and have a look at the text, have a look at those pages in the text that I've identified on Milo, and read through some of these characteristics, and maybe do a bit of your own research onto some of the characteristics you think are most interesting. There's a number of additional readings there you can have a look at on Milo, which give you a bit more detail and understanding of what some of these concepts actually mean.